I remember having like a discussion a while ago with a bunch of people on the left who were saying, oh, the left needs a really good TikTok strategy. And I was like, I don't think that's true, because the way that the far right, and indeed like lots of other, crazy political projects use TikTok, is not to kind of create a coherent political movement. It's to make people feel weird and scared and confused. Like if you go on TikTok and you see like an Andrew Tate video followed by, a conspiracy theory that like lizards are ruling the planet, followed by like the government's controlling the weather, like you're seeing all of this stuff being spewed out that's just making you feel like, I have no idea what's true anymore. I have no idea like, what's going on politically, but it seems vaguely weird and scary. That is a really critical trend, because it just discourages active engagement in politics. It's basically like the world is screwed. I don't know what I'm going to do, but also I'm looking at content that's telling me that if I invest in crypto, then I can protect myself from all of the chaos that's going on around me, right? So there's this other set of trends that's happening, and particularly like powerfully online, I think, but also used pretty cynically by specific far right movements. I think Reform does this really well as well. And you see it in like weird Reform, like local Facebook groups where they start like spreading weird conspiracy theories about local politicians and like, all this sort of stuff.
Right, like the lizards control the local council, and that's why like your bins don't get picked up on time.
Like that kind of, like 15-minute cities, like all of this sort of stuff, like how integral that's become to far right discourse. I think that's another big trend that we're seeing, and perhaps why it's very easy, especially if you spend a lot of time online, to feel like what is going on, like what is happening to the world.
Hi folks, my name's Luke Savage, and if you're a regular listener of the Perspectives Journal podcast, it's possible you know me already. But in case you don't, I'm a writer who worked at the Broadbent Institute many moons ago, and before he passed away, I co-authored a book with the late Ed Broadbent about his life and ideas called Seeking Social Democracy. Now, the conversation you're about to hear is between myself and the British writer Grace Blakeley. Grace was in town last week to receive the Ellen Meiksins Wood Prize, which is awarded annually to a scholar, labor activist, or writer in recognition of outstanding contributions to political theory, social and economic history, sociology, and human rights. In tribute to Professor Wood and her own remarkable contributions to social theory and socialist thought, there is also an annual lecture given by the award recipient, and Grace recently delivered that lecture at Toronto Metropolitan University. If you weren't able to attend yourself, we'll include a link to the video so you can watch or listen to it. It was a fantastic talk, and I had the pleasure of moderating a discussion on stage with Grace afterwards. What follows here, though, is a lengthier conversation the two of us had a few days later. This was a fun and far-reaching discussion that covered a whole lot of ground. We began more or less in the present and spent the first part of it talking mostly about the current political landscape. In the second part, we then dove into somewhat more abstract and philosophical territory, digging a bit deeper into the wider issues of democracy that Grace explored in her lecture and in her really excellent recent book, Vulture Capitalism. Now, you can find both Grace and myself on Substack, Twitter, and Blue Sky. For now, I hope you'll enjoy this conversation. Many thanks to Eric Wickham for recording it, and to the other kind folks at the Broadbent Institute who helped put it all together. Cheers. I guess just to begin, Grace, in a really broad and general way, perhaps a way into everything else that we might talk about. I'm feeling somewhat black-pilled these days myself, and I don't mean that in a kind of nihilistic or a defeatist sense, but I felt much more confident between the years maybe 2015 and 2020 that there was a possibility in the near term for a significant transformation of the political order, of liberal democratic institutions, and so on. And I feel, I suppose, less confident that something like that is on the offing in the immediate term. And I find the moment we're living in very strange to pin down. You know, in your talk the other night, you were speaking about the 1990s and the end of history and that whole moment. And that kind of ends in 2008, in a sense, with the crash. And then throughout the 2010s, you have a series of challenges, both from the right and from the left, to the neoliberal order, to the neoliberal consensus. And then now, with those having failed, at least the ones from the left having failed, and we can talk about the right in a little bit, I find the moment we're in very difficult to interpret. So I guess the two prongs to this question is, how do you personally feel about, having gone through, I think, a trajectory similar to my own? How do you feel about the current moment? How, are you feeling optimistic, pessimistic? And then I guess, secondly, how would you characterize the moment we're living in a broad sense? Is neoliberalism over? How should we think about that in your view?
Yeah. So on the first point, I think we really need to characterize this moment in the context of a much kind of broader sweep of socialist organizing, and even just taking like a fairly limited time period. That point in the 2010s, the kind of electoral, political, democratic socialist revival that you saw in lots of different parts of the rich world, and indeed in the global south as well. It came in the context of what had also been a period of historic defeat for the left, in that kind of end of history moment after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the kind of, liberal revolutionary fervor that came after that, and in the context of everything that was going on in the 2000s with the war on terror, the kind of triumphalism of the new kind of neoliberal realignment of politics, with all these formerly social democratic parties kind of reestablishing themselves firmly in this neoliberal trajectory, and the left really being pushed to the margins. If you can remember, I wasn't obviously politically active at this time, but like at that point in history, the kind of crux of left-wing organizing was all around the kind of ultra-globalization movement and really kind of like international politics, because there were a lot of people who just kind of accepted that, like even limited social democracy is not recoverable in most of the rich world. And the financial crisis of 2008 obviously shatters that whole equilibrium, and gives the impetus for the kind of reemergence or revival of this social democratic / democratic socialist tradition in many, many rich countries. And I think to like understand that moment relative to this moment, I want to talk about someone who we both knew, Leo Panitch, because I remember talking to him about Corbynism and like his thoughts and feelings about communism as well. And he was obviously part of that tradition that can be traced back through someone like Tony Benn and someone like, even like back to Ralph Miliband, right? And this long-standing debate on the British left about whether parliamentary socialism was possible, whether it was possible to kind of work within the institutions of the British state to deliver socialist transformation. Miliband was obviously someone who said, no, that's not possible, and then gave birth to two kids who kind of basically proved that. And Ben was someone who kind of worked under various kind of liberal / social democratic Labour leaders trying to push this democratic socialist agenda from within those institutions, with some important victories, but ultimately kind of, realizing that wasn't really going to happen. And that was the tradition that someone like Leo had worked within. It was basically like, the Labour Party is a dead end. It's like Capital's B team. You're never really going to be able to kind of win that kind of transformation within the British state. And I remember talking to him, and he was like, well, when I first saw the emergence of Corbynism, I was like, well, this is not going to happen. It's going to fail, just like all of these other projects. And then how he kind of slowly and steadily begun to like change his mind and was like, okay, maybe I was wrong. Maybe this will work. And particularly his excitement around the emergence of like this kind of new, not really new, like revived intellectual tradition and policy tradition, and like the emergence of new leaders and like figures who could bring hope and galvanize the British left. Obviously, Leo died in 2021, very sadly. And I think it's worth us going back to that original critique and understanding the failure of Corbynism, Sanders, all of these other movements in that context, and realizing that actually, Leo was right. Those people were right. And that he was also right to kind of shave the edges off that critique when Corbynism was happening. But ultimately, there was something in there that we missed during that moment. And I think a lot of it came back to, I remember at the time, at like the early stages of Corbynism, there were like a few books that had come out that were basically kind of critiquing the way that the left had changed from the like 70s to the kind of early 2000s, and had said we lost focus on institutions, we started fighting all these low-level battles, we focused on what was going on in the global south rather than in the rich world, we lost a focus on institutions basically. And there was this idea that the left had become focused on kind of folk politics, right, and things that wouldn't affect the commanding heights of the economy or the big and powerful institutions of state power. And that really led to, it provided the foundations for, I suppose, the intellectual foundations for what was already happening, which was the emergence of these social movements that ultimately came to challenge the leadership of these social democratic political parties. And we had this swing from like folk politics to institutional politics. And actually, it's very obvious looking back now that we needed a marriage of both. Yeah. Because if you go back to that Milibandian critique of like, why is parliamentary socialism not possible? It exists in this kind of Gramscian tradition of seeing the state as a social relation, like capital. So, policy outcomes reflect the balance of power within society. And, there is a prong of that critique that says, okay, well, because of that, we live in capitalist societies. It's impossible to transform the capitalist state because, it is basically not necessarily a crude instrument or a tool, but it tends to work in the interests of capital. And then there's another prong which says, well, actually, if you manage to shift the balance of power within society, then that will allow you to change the balance in this social relationship and therefore change outcomes within the state. And that, I think, is something that was lost, right? This idea that if you could change the balance of power within society, then you could begin to shift what was going on within the state. I think the kind of folk political tradition had no focus on state power. It was just like, we need to focus on society.
It's almost actively averse to,
exactly.
You shouldn't concern yourself with it at all.
But then the institutional tradition that kind of followed that just ignored the need to shift the balance of power in society and was like, no, we can just do a kind of not quite like vanguard party approach.
But you capture the state and then you've won.
Exactly. Yeah. And like I count myself very much in that tradition of this naive idea that you could literally capture the British state and use it to change things, use it as a tool to change things. And, I don't think it's that surprising because a lot of us who were involved in that movement maybe weren't familiar with that longer term, deeper rooted critique of capitalist institutions. And also because a lot of us came through like a policy trajectory where we would literally be working in think tanks, where we were designing policies to give to political parties to say, do this and you can change things, right? It's a kind of naive approach to political institutions. But I think what's come out of the other side of that for a lot of us is the realization that, oh, okay, if we want to do the thing that we said that we wanted to do, which is this institutional approach, this like idea of kind of going in and shifting and kind of taking control of state institutions, you cannot do that without first or simultaneously building power throughout all of these other different social institutions and shifting the balance of power in society. So we've kind of come, like, I guess this is the thesis after the kind of the synthesis after the thesis antithesis of this kind of like dialectical approach of realizing, okay, right, we need folk politics, we need like, activism, we need to organize, and we also need a focus on institutions. And yeah, that's kind of been, I think, the realization that I've had. I think it's the realization that a lot of people have had. And that means that we exist in a much longer term struggle. I actually, again, spoke to Leo for an edited collection I put together just before he died. And he was talking about how lots of people were asking him about, his ideas about how we build power. And it all comes down to like these forms of organizing and raising consciousness and awareness, and people saying, well, we don't have time to do that because of the climate crisis and all of these really, really pressing issues. And he was like, well, this is the only way, we cannot not do this. If we're going to be able to take on a state that is in the pockets of ExxonMobil, then you need to be able to build a kind of counter power that's able to resist that. And so that's where I see it. I see that we are in this process of kind of reconstituting, rebuilding a base and a social formation that's going to allow us to get to the point of reorienting towards institutional goals again. And another thing that someone else actually said to me a while ago, someone who was very involved in Corbynism and very knowledgeable about all these things and who'd lived through many of these things, is that the tide goes in and the tide comes out. And, sometimes you find yourself being a bit of trash that's washed up on the beach as the tide's gone out. And your job is just to stay there for long enough and just wait for the tide to come in again. And I think that's really where we are right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in many ways, I feel much more optimistic, in spite of what I said off the top, than I did maybe before 2015. I mean, I remember watching the British election in 2015 and the early stages of the leadership race before Corbyn got in, and just feeling like everything is so moribund. You had even the supposedly lefty candidate, right, Andy Burnham, was I think he called like wealth taxes the politics of envy, and that wasn't even the right. Liz Kendall was the right of that race, and it felt like there's just no prospects at all. In the U.S. context as well, before Bernie got in, or even when he got in, but I think everyone assumed this is going to be a chaotic, he's going to get 10% in Iowa and drop out and endorse Clinton or something. And obviously we've come out of that whole period, and we don't have institutional power to show for it. But I do think, not to dismiss what you're calling folk politics writ large, but I mean, folk politics was all there was. When I was first introduced to the left in the early 2000s, when I was, arguing with Bush supporters on, web forums in the early 2000s, folk politics was all there was. It was like, we're going to do alternative consumerism, we're going to read Adbusters, and then even the sort of more proactive side came through, things like the anti-globalization movement, but there was no sense that we actually can change anything on the domestic front, that we can even aspire to institutional power, that we should. And I don't think that's the feeling anymore. I mean, the left does have many, I think its ideas are much richer and more serious than they were previously. Having said that, I mean, it is a pretty dark moment politically, geopolitically especially, thinking not only of Gaza, obviously, but the second Trump administration, which is really, at least in its first 100 days, certainly trying to address many of the issues that hamstrung, at least from the conservative movement's perspective, the first Trump administration, in terms of really pushing this agenda of the new right forward. So I'm curious, I mean, what is your assessment of the second Trump administration? I mean, particularly, but not exclusively, when it comes to trade policy, comes to industrial policy, these things that perhaps are more heterodox than, the conservatism that, we've mainly known before. What's your sense of kind of where the American right is at and where the global right is at in relation to this stuff?
So, like what you were saying at the start, that we're in this particularly dark moment, I think that is obviously true, particularly geopolitically. But I think it's supposed to be dark because of everything we were just talking about, because of how close left movements got. And we're talking about, in the case of 2017 with Jeremy Corbyn, like a few thousand votes in a few key constituencies, how close those movements got to institutional power. Now, look, I'm not saying that Corbynism would have been a kind of raging success and facilitated the birth of socialism in the UK had Corbyn got into power, for all of the reasons that we've just been discussing, right? Which is that we had to kind of try and backfill the existence of this social movement across, the labor movement, across, community organizing, all of these different bases of power that are really important if you're going to go into an institution like the British state. But it would have still been a very, very scary time for the ruling class in the UK and around the world. And the last time I think that they would have been that scared would have been a point like the 70s, right? When you had powerful labor movements in particular that were able to shut down entire economies, but also really kind of vibrant political movements, social movements, the peace movement, anti-apartheid movements, who were really like challenging elite discourses and narratives and generating real, profound, popular pressure. And of course, the response to that moment of ungovernability, I mentioned this in my talk in the lecture, that there's this idea that time in the 70s, the issue was that society had become ungovernable across both the economic and political and social spheres, and that neoliberalism was a response to that perceived crisis of governability, right? That it wasn't about creating free markets or shrinking the state. It was actually about using economic and political power to crush those kind of, pre-revolutionary movements almost. And I think we're in a similar position today. Obviously, the 2010s, the left arguably was not as strong as it was in the 70s. But that sense among those at the top that they came really close to losing in a big way, and the reaction to that, I think we're basically living through the reaction to that, which is to kind of convince us that we never really got that close, that it was always going to lose, that things are impossible to change. And I think actually what's going on in Gaza is in some ways linked to that. Naomi Klein, a while ago, wrote this piece called The Iron Dome is Global. And her argument was basically that it's so important for political elites to not give any ground on this conflict, because it is really important for them to reinforce the message that resistance does not work, right? They have to enforce that belief that resistance doesn't work. And if they are perceived to kind of crack in response to protest movements, in response to boycotts, right? Then that is creates a crisis of legitimacy, basically. Because if they allow us to believe that our organizing works, then that encourages us. Whereas if we all accept the belief that actually it doesn't work, which is something that I'm seeing a lot now, right? Because we didn't win elections at the time that the left was fighting elections, then it must mean that the whole project is futile. Then they've won, right? So I think that's going on the one hand. That's one pillar of the strategy, which is just like aggressively ignoring, undermining, delegitimizing any attempt of kind of left-wing critique. And that is mainly coming from kind of the liberal end of the spectrum, right? And you see this all the time when liberals ally with the far right to crush far left movements, whether that was in France or Brazil or, wherever. I think it's happened here a few times, right? Yeah. In regional government, yeah. And then I think there's another thing going on, which is the kind of second pillar of this strategy, which is basically kind of sowing chaos and confusion and fear, which is just the bread and butter of the far right today, and creating so much just chaos and noise that it becomes impossible to imagine what a coherent political project would look like in response to that. And that's the kind of more popular facing strategy right now. I remember having like a discussion a while ago with a bunch of people on the left who were saying, oh, the left needs a really good TikTok strategy. And I was like, I don't think that's true, because the way that the far right, and indeed like lots of other, crazy political projects use TikTok, is not to kind of create a coherent political movement. It's to make people feel weird and scared and confused. Like if you go on TikTok and you see like an Andrew Tate video followed by, a conspiracy theory that like lizards are ruling the planet, followed by like the government's controlling the weather, like you're seeing all of this stuff being spewed out that's just making you feel like, I have no idea what's true anymore. I have no idea like, what's going on politically, but it seems vaguely weird and scary. That is a really critical trend, because it just discourages active engagement in politics. It's basically like the world is screwed. I don't know what I'm going to do, but also I'm looking at content that's telling me that if I invest in crypto, then I can protect myself from all of the chaos that's going on around me, right? So there's this other set of trends that's happening, and particularly like powerfully online, I think, but also used pretty cynically by specific far right movements. I think Reform does this really well as well. And you see it in like weird Reform, like local Facebook groups where they start like spreading weird conspiracy theories about local politicians and like, all this sort of stuff.
Right, like the lizards control the local council, and that's
Yeah.
why like your bins don't get picked up
Exactly.
on time.
Like that kind of, like 15-minute cities, like all of this sort of stuff, like how integral that's become to far right discourse. I think that's another big trend that we're seeing, and perhaps why it's very easy, especially if you spend a lot of time online, to feel like what is going on, like what is happening to the world. And then the final part of what I see happening with regards to the right as well is something I mentioned in the talk, which is basically responding to a crisis of neoliberal individualism, where people feel angry, isolated, alone, despairing because of all these trends, and providing them with a sense of belonging and community. And you see this happening in really interesting ways. So there was a story in the UK of, I think it was like local MMA groups that had basically been, someone had kind of gone into these groups and found that they were just kind of recruiting grounds for the far right. It was like mainly young men coming along, allegedly learning like some form of martial arts, and actually it being this like route into far right politics. And that was a really powerful way of doing it, because it provides all the things that we are now missing because of the decimation of our communities and our community spaces, a sense of belonging, solidarity, a sense of kind of, you know, community, I guess, that so many people no longer have. And the far right is doing this really effectively. You know, the whole thing about like local Facebook groups, being able to organize people in their communities to give them a sense of belonging and like a collective project to resist this pervasive sense of decline that we see everywhere, but particularly in the places that they're doing so well. And when you take all of those trends together, it's basically, as you say, like a recipe for chaos, for just a sense of total dislocation, like of not knowing who you are, what you're doing, where you're going, where politics is going, all that sort of stuff. And I really think that it is, and this links actually to my answer to the first question, it's up to the left to try and answer that, not by like getting really good at TikTok, although that kind of, I guess, would be helpful in some ways, but by actually giving people ways to solve their problems by engaging in forms of organizing. So like bringing people into the labor movement when they're not getting paid enough, like bringing people into community organizing when their local swimming pool gets shut down, like helping people who are really just angry and upset about what's going on in the world to participate in protest movements. And there are some really fascinating examples of left political parties who've been able to do this. Like one of my favorites, and one that I've written about a lot, and anyone who's followed my stuff will have heard me talking about before, is the Belgian Workers' Party, who, when I've been over there, have just told me some amazing stories about how they've like gone into communities, had barbecues with people who have like been voting for the far right, and said like, what are you actually concerned about? And because they have this like really coherent, organized political structure, they're able to answer and respond to those issues. So like they organized this community that was worried about literally about their local swimming pool getting shut down. They got this community to come out to the swimming pool, all the kids like, you know, jumping in, like basically occupying it as a protest to say, don't shut down our local swimming pool, right? And it's this kind of stuff that provides a way out from this sense of confusion, of dislocation, of isolation, that I think is what is creating this breeding ground for the far right. And it also, in some senses, allows us to avoid the cul-de-sac of arguing with liberals about whether left politics is possible, which I do think is a cul-de-sac. You can't prove to a liberal that wealth taxes are possible. You just have to build a social base powerful enough to ensure that they become inevitable.
Mm-hmm. So I guess just as a final point on the right, I mean, you know, I think we've largely been talking about the far right and the new right in terms of of incoherence, in terms of conspiracy theories. But, you know, the far right is now in control of the world's most powerful state. In the UK, you know, Reform swept the local elections recently. They won the by-election in Runcorn as well, which I don't think, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think UKIP never elected anybody directly to Parliament, did they?
They had one MP at one point, but I think it was he switched.
Carswell, right? He switched from the Tories. So this is kind of a, you know, Nigel Farage's slow, you know, long march through British electoral politics is continuing apace. So how do you think everything you were just discussing? I mean, when this is manifest at the level of the level of the state, either through something like Trumpism or through hopefully not, but a hypothetical reform government in the UK, which some polls certainly are beginning to indicate could be possible, at least theoretically. How coherent do you find the program of the new right? I mean, we've been talking about it again as in terms of incoherence, and it's reactive. It is exploiting gaps or failures or dysfunctions in the neoliberal order, but there's clearly some kind of a proactive, a constructive project here of some kind. So how do you see that, and do you think it differs from the right as we knew it 10 years ago, 15 years ago? Is it merely a kind of an accelerated or more egregious form of that? How do you see it?
Yeah, so I think that whole point about like the experience of kind of chaos and dislocation, that's very much like a social trend that the right is taking advantage of and exacerbating at the kind of the individual and community level. In terms of the actual political project, I do think it is in some senses more coherent. I think it's coherent but divided, let's say. Now, in terms of like the distinction between the kind of chaotic, conspiratorial agenda that's shown to the world versus the kind of vaguely coherent political project, I think one great example of this is someone like Elon Musk, right? So initially he starts out as someone who is like perceived as a guy who's like, if not woke, then certainly like progressive, and running this electric car company that he's like, we're going to change the world, we're going to do amazing things, like known for tweeting vaguely progressive stuff, like on certainly on like on the terrain of cultural issues. And then suddenly there's this big shift and everyone's like, whoa, what's happened? This guy's become like a massive reactionary. And it was pretty obvious when you trace his trajectory what happened. He basically, in like, I think it was around 2012, started getting into issues with workers at Tesla who were trying to unionize. And this experience of basically having to union bust and doing it really coherently and really effectively starts to, I think, make him realize that a more authoritarian type of politics is needed, a more kind of, aggressive form of politics to protect his interests and the interests of capital. And it's really interesting how his trajectory continues because, he's union busting behind the scenes, like very effectively. The ILO has called him one of the greatest union busters that they've seen. But to everyone else, like to the kind of the rest of the world, the issues that he's focusing on are all kind of culture war issues, and just kind of baiting people and doing this kind of classic far right strategy of like, owning snowflakes and canceling people and just like calling into question cherished beliefs among the left and like causing upset as a result of that. And I think that kind of project to cloak what is an essentially kind of a hyper-authoritarian form of neoliberal politics in the language of the culture war is really what like the new right is about. And I say like hyper-authoritarian form of neoliberal politics because it is like all of the stuff that neoliberalism did really well, like fighting back against the labor movement, tax cuts for the rich, just like, drastically weighting the balance of power in favor of capital and away from labor. And there was always like an authoritarian tendency within neoliberalism. You see that very clearly with Thatcher, with Pinochet, like, the kind of the first and best example of this. But it was kind of like rhetorically tucked away behind the scenes. There was always this kind of double move going on, which is like, we want freedom, we want individual freedom and free markets. And sometimes we're going to have to use state power to crush those who get in the way of freedom, right? But it was always kind of tucked away. And that's the kind of contradiction that I look at in vulture capitalism. But I think now that more authoritarian bent is really kind of being foregrounded amongst much of the right. And there is this realization, again, I think partly going back to the success of those movements in the 2010s, that if you want to retain your power and wealth in an era of just astonishing inequality, you're going to have to use force. You're going to have to use force on the one hand. So that means like really, crushing protest movements, coming down really hard against any form of resistance, like really not entertaining any form of like pro-labor legislation. It's not a coincidence that like even Labour in the UK has like really failed to deliver what it said it would on workers' rights, and Trump's obviously come for the NLRB really, really quickly. That kind of authoritarian, like anti-union, anti-protest trend that's always existed within neoliberalism, but is now really being foregrounded. And that being combined with a kind of cultural authoritarianism that was not really so clear in the original neoliberal movement. It was there. Like Thatcherism was not tolerant at all across a whole host of different metrics. But again, there were lots of neoliberals, and indeed, I think the people who were at the forefront of the neoliberal movement would have conceived of themselves as kind of socially tolerant people. Quinn Slobodian's new book, actually, Hayek's Bastards, is really interesting about how a kind of separate current of neoliberals who always really kind of were much more close to this just like really culturally regressive and authoritarian bent, how they organized very effectively and pushed their agenda, and how they've kind of become dominant. So yeah, I think that's the project that we now find ourselves with. It's a kind of aggressive, authoritarian, like populist anti-popular movement form of neoliberalism that is really trying to kind of consolidate and deepen the gains that were made from the 1980s onwards in the context of much greater, what in the 2010s was much greater levels of resistance, and certainly much more kind of popular antipathy towards that project. So in that sense, I don't think that there's been like this decisive break with neoliberalism, because I don't see neoliberalism in the way that the neoliberals themselves did. I think, you can see all these strands of authoritarianism and kind of culturally regressive attitudes in the original project. But it's certainly, there's been a shift within that movement. And arguably, that will evolve into something different over time. I think that is definitely possible. And you see the emergence of that with Trumpism, which is like when this really hyper-authoritarian form of politics actually starts to clash with the interests of capital. Because obviously what Trumpism represents is like this weird meshing of neoliberalism with like mercantilism almost. So it's like, tax cuts for the rich, going against workers, kind of really, again, trying to consolidate that shift away from workers and towards capital that we saw with the original neoliberal movement. But also with this like very mercantilist strategy of saying we want to protect our capitalists from competition from abroad. And you can both see how that makes sense from a Trumpian perspective, and also see how there's some really big contradictions with the kind of the neoliberal idea, the neoliberal ideas that creates. And ultimately, I think that shift towards this like mercantilist, protectionist form of politics, the reason that I can see it as linked with the original neoliberal desire to kind of augment the power of capital is basically a question about technological supremacy and how to protect the technological supremacy of American capital against basically Chinese.
China.
This is the real issue here. It's not about jobs. It's not about exports or imports. It's really about the fact that China has leveraged a really impressive strategy of forcing American multinationals producing in China to slowly drip feed them with US technology, and then ultimately creating a knowledge economy that is delivering much greater advances in some areas than are visible in other parts of the world. And that obviously being a threat to the supremacy of American capitalism. And so Trump stepping in to try and stop that from happening kind of in its infancy, although it's actually not really in its infancy, and in some ways it's too late. But obviously, whilst that makes sense in terms of the interest of American capital, it certainly doesn't make sense in terms of the kind of philosophy of like pure neoliberalism. So yeah, it's complicated, basically. It's like in some ways, there's a continuation of the original neoliberal movement that is going on here, and also in some senses a break. And I think that we are seeing a kind of evolution of neoliberalism into something much darker, something much more authoritarian as a result.
Yeah, I mean, with just on the trade point specifically, there are aspects of Trump's trade war that it seems to me even go directly against the interests of American capital. In as much as, so we're here in Canada, which Trump has been threatening to annex for, the last few months. And, Trump's conception of what the U.S.-Canada trade relationship is, it's astonishing, really. I mean, free trade, which we've had in Canada since the late 1980s, and we fought a whole election in which the right was for free trade, and both the New Democratic Party, the parliamentary left, and then also the Liberal Party were against it in that election. And, the fear in Canada at the time was really, we're going to become an economic colony of the United States. Canada is a country that's very rich in natural resources, but we have really, since the Second World War, built up an economic model which is, heavily involves exporting raw resources abroad for manufacture, in some cases then buying them directly back. So, and even, our manufacturing sector, the automotive sector in particular, we don't have, it's General Motors, right? It's Chrysler, it's American, it's Ford, it's American companies operating in places like southwestern Ontario. And so one of the things I've found very perplexing in Trump's trade war is the fact that, as I see it, the status quo on trade already reflected the dominance of American capital, right? And it seems to me that, obviously that's all very Canada specific, but what's your perspective on that?
I think, to understand this contradiction between the kind of neo-mercantilist agenda that Trump is pushing and neoliberalism, we really have to understand the right's commitment to free trade and where that comes from the start. I read a really interesting book recently called Ricardo's Dream by Nat Dyer. And he was basically Ricardo obviously comes up with this idea of comparative advantage, which is the foundation of the argument for free trade for many liberals. It's like, if you, country A, specialize in producing something and I, country B, specialize in producing something, even if you are way less efficient at producing that thing than I am, it still makes sense for us to specialize and trade with each other. That becoming the foundation for the whole free trade agenda. And what Nat shows is the real reason that the UK started kind of pushing all of these free trade treaties with different countries is that it allowed the UK to leverage, in some ways, its political and imperial power to force open markets that could then be kind of exploited to a greater or lesser extent, to also the benefit of certain elites within those countries that were being exploited. And you see this, throughout the whole history of free trade. Free trade is always embraced by countries or empires, generally empires, when they realize that they can trade freely with the rest of the world whilst retaining their supremacy. And that actually the spread of free trade will allow them to deepen that supremacy, because if they force open lots of markets and they happen to be home to the most technologically advanced multinational corporations, then those corporations will be able to go into those markets and exploit what's going on, exploit their natural resources, maybe, outsource labor, whatever. So, you see this with the British Empire, you see this with the American Empire, pushing free trade when it just so happens that free trade is going to advantage them. And what's happening now with the US is that there is this recognition that actually, if things continue, the US will no longer retain that position, that role as technological hegemon, economic hegemon. But it all really comes down to kind of to technological supremacy at the end of the day, under capitalist social relations. And this is the real crux of it, right? Because yes, as we are now, what Washington Consensus, post-Washington Consensus order, the liberal rules-based order, dollar supremacy, all of that benefits the US. It allows the US to run these twin current account and fiscal deficits. It means that the US government can borrow as much as it likes and everyone still wants dollars. It means that it can have this massive trade deficit where it imports cheap goods from the rest of the world and everyone still wants dollars to invest in American financial assets. And so much money has flown into US financial markets, particularly in the last kind of decade or so. And that has, allowed the American middle class in particular to, not experience the same level of hardship and decline as you've seen in other parts of the rich world. And it's made American elites extremely wealthy and, made the American financial system even more dominant, like ironically, than it was before the financial crisis of 2008.
And tech as well.
And tech, of course. Yeah, that being the other side of the story. But the issue is that China is able now to compete technologically. Chinese companies are able to compete technology with US companies in a way that they haven't before. And the reason for this is the particular model of development that the Chinese state pursued, which was to create these kind of zones, these special economic zones throughout the country where different rules applied, and where Western multinationals could come in, produce things, but generally they would have to do so as part of like a joint venture with a Chinese company or a Chinese businessman. And slowly over time, that model allowed Chinese businesses to learn from American technologies, American, management styles, and basically absorb through osmosis some of that technological supremacy that the US worked very, very hard to guard through, all these trade treaties that had huge, vast sections about intellectual property rights. So China kind of slowly was able to do that. And then, of course, with the massive help of the state, these companies grew and became much, much more dominant. And now you see companies like BYD, the electric car manufacturer, DeepSeek, even like Temu and Shein becoming household names, as well as all of these astonishing advances that you don't really hear about that China is spearheading, particularly when it comes to green technologies, right? That the Chinese state has been kind of on the forefront of that for a long time for very self-interested reasons, because there's a huge ecological crisis in much of China, and they know that they need to be able to deal with that. So that kind of issue of like rising technological supremacy for China threatens to create this tipping point where free trade no longer primarily benefits the US, and instead this kind of, liberal rules-based order actually ends up benefiting China. And you see this even in China today with the kind of selective embrace of like free trade politics by Chinese elites. And they will use, WTO rules as like a stick to beat the Americans with when they say you're subsidizing your industries, right? So there is this big shift going on. But I think what's really funny and ironic is that Trump has come in at a time where it's too late to undo this. You cannot now stop China from emerging as this technological hegemon. And as a result, the policies that he's implemented, which may have worked, 10 years ago, are actually working to deepen China's dominance. The CEO of NVIDIA came out and said this the other day. He was like, all of these protectionist policies that the US has implemented around chips have actually helped to support the growth of the Chinese chips industry. Chips being microchips, by the way, not crisps. So this is obviously now happening really clearly with US financial markets and US government debt, because this happened during the first crisis. It's starting to happen again, just like as we're talking with investors in US government debt getting very worried about the sustainability of that debt because of Trump passing this big bill of loads of tax cuts. People are starting to question whether or not the dollar is going to remain the world's reserve currency. They're starting to question the viability of US government debt. There is this broad movement away from US assets, which, like, as I said, started to happen a few months ago. Then everyone was like, oh, no, it's fine. We were wrong. We were too hasty. And now it's starting to happen again, which is this classic kind of like, almost the classic dynamic you see in a bubble, right? Of everyone being like, oh my God, this thing is going to be amazing. And then like, oh shit, what if it's not so amazing? And then like, oh no, actually we were wrong. It's fine. And then, oh, actually, no, this is a big shift. So yeah, the fact that this set of policies that Trump has designed to try and not necessarily Trump, but, obviously Trump isn't just Trump. He's representative of a particular set of interests within American capitalism. the policies that he's designed to try and fight China have actually ended up coming back to bite him because they were introduced too late. That's what I think explains a lot of what we're seeing right now.
To I guess cap the first part of this conversation, we began by talking about the left. We've now talked about the right. Let's talk about liberals and liberalism a little bit. I mean, I guess to go back to what you were saying before, I think you brought in, I think, a very useful distinction, which is the distinction between, right neoliberals and left neoliberals. And, it's interesting if you chart the history since the 1980s, where, neoliberalism's first incursion really comes from the right. It's, as you said, the language is much less a language of kind of tolerance and openness. There's an anti-cosmopolitanism to it. But then in the 90s, during the end of history, it's Bill Clinton, it's Tony Blair, it's Gerard Schroeder. It's much more globalist in its orientation. It's much more about, at least rhetorically, progress and modernization and all these kinds of things. And it feels like increasingly since then, really since the 2010s, that gradually the pendulum has been swinging in the other direction, such that now we have right neoliberalism back in power, but even the left neoliberals, there is and you mentioned Musk and his trajectory. I think he's emblematic of something much bigger, which is a kind of hard right turn from liberals, and by that I mean not just people who are were culturally aligned with liberalism. So people in American tech, for example, Zuckerberg, Musk, obviously, guys that are now want to be based or whatever. But it's also political liberalism, right? We're seeing increasingly anti-immigrant politics, right? This is 2 or 3 weeks after Starmer gave his Island of Strangers speech. Here in Canada, we have Mark Carney, who isn't really moving to the right on cultural issues so much, although we have Canada is introducing certain restrictions on immigration. The rhetoric around it's a little different, but in terms of economic policy, Carneyism definitely represents a shift to the right compared to something like Trudeauism, its predecessor. And yeah, I mean, what do you make of what do you make of the shift to the right, specifically among the left neoliberals? Where's that coming from? I mean, it struck me that really throughout my whole life and throughout my whole career writing about liberals, the only way centrist liberals seem to know how to respond to defeat or to react to a resurgent right is by moving to the right themselves. And I think we're seeing right now around, pretty much everything we've been discussing, and worth underscoring Gaza again here. That particularly since Trump's reelection, the left neoliberals have been shifting hard to the right as well. So, I mean, what do you make of that?
So, yeah, this kind of like right turn from liberals as like alongside the kind of consolidation of the far right, I think basically comes from a place of fear and anxiety in the wake of a period of triumphalism and self-confidence, right? They're scared of a number of different things. And I think the first of those things is slower growth, slower productivity, and the realization that the kind of end of history moment was built on basically kind of shaky economic foundations, and that those foundations have now gone. And secondly, relatedly, the rise of resistance to the liberal project and their kind of inability to figure out how to orient themselves towards that resistance. So this first trend of kind of slower growth, I think basically liberal politics works from a positive sum perspective. So the idea is we don't have to fiddle around with the balance of power in society. We don't have to worry about redistribution. We don't have to worry about, who is gaining as much from growth. We just have to worry about growth. And you see this epitomized in the Starmer project today. The issue is that doesn't work anymore. It worked from the 1990s. You know, in some ways it worked. It was like, in some senses, the foundation of social democracy as well. But from, particularly from like the mid 80s and the 90s onwards, you had a number of different trends that came together to deliver this really exceptional period of economic growth that benefited lots of different segments of the global population fairly broadly, although it was obviously concentrated in the rich world. So you had this like renewed wave of globalization. And this was driven by a number of different things, obviously the fall of the Berlin Wall, but something that is less spoken about but really, really important was containerization and the spread of kind of global shipping and the fall in logistics costs and transportation costs that allowed for that first wave of outsourcing and offshoring. Then obviously, you know, the ICT revolution, as it was originally called in the 1990s, facilitating communication between, you know, subsidiaries of different companies and also within companies, making that project of kind of a globalized production process much easier. And then, of course, on top of that, and this was much more of a thing from kind of the late 90s onwards, was the bubble in financial markets. Driven by the kind of real fundamental desire of neoliberalism, which was to create this like property owning democracy. So the state, in particularly the US, but also the UK and other countries, playing a really active role in extending credit to middle class households to allow them to purchase their own houses, to give them a stake in this economic model. And that being, you know, bolstered by this completely grossly unsustainable financial system that was also itself kind of globalizing in novel ways. So all of those kind of trends, and probably, you know, loads more, came together to deliver this exceptional period of growth that created this like unique period of like very low levels of class consciousness, particularly for people in the rich world.
We're all middle class now, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So like this is like founded on like economic growth. So the idea that, you know, things are getting better and better and better each year, but it's consolidated by this desire to create kind of these mini capitalist households that like own a house and like have a 401k or a pension, so they can watch their wealth increasing each year as the stock market expands and grows. But even in like, you know, the rest of the world, even in the kind of politics of development, right, there was this real sense, and very different from the like the post-war period or like the social democratic period, where there was much more of a sense of kind of leaders in the global south, that there was a trade-off between kind of integration with the rich world and development. And there was this sense of a need to try and protect their economies and industrialize. That was all gone after the kind of structural adjustment of the 1980s, after the triumph of the Washington Consensus. And there was just like this one teleological path of we have to open up our markets, we have to integrate with the rich world, and ultimately development will come through economic growth. And this fueled this like moment of triumphalism. I think there was the epitome of this liberal self-confidence was this book I remember reading. I think it was when I was at university. It was Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat, right? Do you remember this book?
Oh, very intimately acquainted.
Yeah. This was like, you know, everything's going the right way. Democracy is spreading. Prosperity is spreading. Poor countries are going to get richer through capitalism. Everyone's going to get nice middle-class jobs. Like no thought for like, okay, well, if everyone becomes middle-class, then who's going to produce the stuff that the middle-class people buy? But, you know, that was a question for another day, right? And that really started to ebb, obviously, with the financial crisis of 2008. But it has really like shattered now, particularly after the kind of electoral political socialist projects of the 2010s. And I think the shift in liberal thinking is epitomized by the transition from that Friedman book to another book I picked up the other day, actually, because I was very interested in it. It's by a guy called Robert Kaplan called Wasteland. And this guy, I was interested to pick up this book because I remembered studying some of his work in my African studies course. And he was this theorist of the kind of the new wars that were taking place after the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was like these kind of like atavistic, nonsensical like civil wars that were not taking place over ideology or anything, coherent or comprehensible. It was just like people randomly attacking each other, right? And this was, everything from like the Rwandan genocide through to, what had taken place in the former Yugoslavia, etc. And he had this kind of like dark view of these wars that were emerging, but ultimately had this belief that like reason and enlightenment and the kind of the foundations of Western civilization would slowly make things better for people. And like, if people understood why these wars were happening, then we'd be able to contain them. And he's just written this book, Wasteland, which is really astonishing to read, thinking about the transition of the liberal mindset, because he's basically like, we put too much faith in democracy. Right. We put too much faith in the idea that people's kind of really negative, conflictual nature could be managed. And we're now reaching this moment of just like all out chaos where, we have all these authoritarian leaders who are challenging the West. The spread of democracy is halting. People are losing faith in democracy in the rich world. And he has a number of points where he basically says, like, we need to rethink what we mean by freedom, because freedom without order is worthless. I think, that's basically the transition that he sets up. And that, I think, is really what is going on in the mindset of liberals. They had this moment where they thought, we've won, like capitalism works, it goes really well with democracy. We don't need to force people to believe the things that we want to believe or do the things that we want them to do. To now, where they're like, oh, wait, people no longer organically believe in the ideas that we want them to believe in. So we're going to have to actually move towards a form of authoritarianism to enforce those beliefs, because those beliefs are right. And if it just so happens that people don't realize they're right, then we're going to force them to think that these beliefs are right. So it's like the kind of, like a more authoritarian and forceful agenda behind liberal politics, which I think we're seeing emerge in a lot of different places. And then the corollary of that is, as I was kind of alluding to at the start, the move from a positive sum approach to political economy to a more zero-sum approach to political economy. Now, the original liberal movement, as I said, was founded on this kind of positive-sum idea of growth will lift us all out of poverty and, everyone will get better. So we don't need to worry about the balance of power within society. We don't need to worry about class anymore. And that has evaporated as the material foundations of that growth model have evaporated. So all of those things I mentioned that facilitated that wave of growth alongside this really like existential challenge for Western capitalism, well, particularly in the US and Europe, which is this slowdown in productivity. And again, that is related to those questions of technological supremacy that we were talking about before. So obviously, if you don't have constant increases in productivity, then you're just not going to be able to sustain those long-term increases in growth, which provided the foundations for that economic model. That kind of slowdown in productivity, really facilitating a much more zero-sum approach to politics, which liberals would always say is more associated with the far right and the far left. Liberals love to say we're positive sum. We believe that we can meet everyone's needs through growth and that you don't need to have any real conflict in politics. It's just an optimization problem, to now actually accepting the fact much more that there are trade-offs that are going to have to be made. And that acceptance that trade-offs have to be made kind of undermines just the entire edifice of liberal politics. Because if trade-offs have to be made, then different interest groups legitimately can fight with each other to determine where those trade-offs fall. And as soon as you get different interest groups fighting with each other, then you have the reemergence of a form of class politics, and you can't just hide those divides anymore. And I think that's really where we are. It's like a liberal who is scared about the end of that kind of end of history moment, and who is also coming to realize that the economic foundation of their politics, which is the idea that growth will save everything, no longer works.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that one of the things liberals have periodically tried to do since the mid 2010s is they're responding to both the left and the right by trying to find new ways to essentially abolish politics. Because one of the ways, and you were remarking on this earlier, and in your talk the other day, one of the ways they've responded to various challenges to the liberal order is by indicting democracy itself, right? So, I'm not familiar with the Robert Kaplan book, but if you look at one of the ways that the liberal class in America is responding to Kamala Harris's defeat, it's through things like the abundance movement, so-called, right? It's trying to graft a new story that's almost kind of an apolitical one onto the same model, and just hoping that this somehow gets the engine running again. I mean, here in Canada, we're kind of the exception at the moment because, while a figure like Mark Carney has a program that in some ways is very similar to someone like Keir Starmer, he actually has he secured a popular mandate for it in a way that, Starmer was clearly not able to do, right? Starmer has this big parliamentary majority on 33% of the voters, something fewer votes than Corbyn got in 2019. Here, for a variety of reasons that I don't think are really replicable anywhere else, Carney has been able to, up to this point anyway, present himself as this kind of Jupiterian figure who is able to operate above politics. I think this is the one country since maybe 2008 where somebody could run on the message, I'm a banker and I'm here to help, and have it work. But it's funny, just to go back to what you were saying before, I think in some sense, when it comes to this, the way you're accounting for the rightward shift of liberals, what all these people are kind of gesturing at or grasping at in some way is something like the Chinese Communist Party, right? Like what they're all craving is some kind of an institutional structure or a form of politics that's external to popular democracy that allows them to basically do what they want. And I guess, in China, it's really undergirded by, there's a civilizational nationalism that's kind of the glue. In the West, it's much more technocratic. I'm not really sure where I'm going with this, except to say that I don't think any of this stuff is really going to work, right? Starmerism isn't going to work. Carneyism, I'm not really sure where the Carney program will end up, and they haven't tabled a budget yet. But it looks like the plan is for a sort of emergency Keynesianism, followed by the usual suite of tax cuts and a very sort of neoliberalized spending program, lots of public-private partnerships, and that sort of thing. So I'm fairly confident in saying that none of this is going to work. It's not going to kind of consolidate a new, certainly not a new electoral coalition around any of these parties, but I'm struggling to envision kind of what the next stage looks like. If we're talking about the dialectic of right neoliberals and left neoliberals back and forth since the 1980s, what on earth is the next stage of this going to look like? Is the synthesis state capitalism, a la the CCP?
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely, I think, a thread within liberal thought, and that which has been kind of tangential to or a part of the left for a while, which is basically the kind of Mazzucato politics of like, oh no, actually we forgot we do actually need a state to do things. But it's again, the fact that this was part of the left, of the kind of left critique of neoliberalism, I think demonstrates a really profound misunderstanding on the left as to what neoliberalism actually was. We bought the rhetoric that it meant a small state that didn't do very much, when actually, the neoliberal state has been, across much of the rich world, extremely interventionist.
Well, it hasn't gotten smaller, right? It's gotten bigger.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, the idea that this kind of entrepreneurial state project was somehow contrary to neoliberalism, I don't think is right. But the fact that it's gaining traction is, I think, a recognition of one of the many crises that are now afflicting Western capitalism. And this kind of abundance agenda as well is an attempt to deal with that crisis, the crisis that was caused by the very politics that people like Ezra Klein have advocated, without challenging its foundations. And the issue with the whole abundance movement thing is that age of abundance, in which they understood abundance, right, which was basically an idea I imagine that his understanding of abundance would have been one that was formed during that moment that I was speaking about from the end of the 90s onwards, where it did seem like everything could get better forever. But there was no recognition of the kind of fundamentally weak foundations of that, and the fact that that age is over, right? And it's over in so many very obvious ways. So the first one that we've already discussed is this kind of productivity problem, and relatedly the shift of technological supremacy from west to east. And there's no answer to that really, because like an obvious answer would be, okay, the state needs to play a more active role in fostering research and development, in educating people, in like investing in infrastructure. But all of that takes a long time. Like if the state suddenly turns around and says, I'm going to do much more of a kind of, industrial strategy for these various different areas of the economy, that would have helped 10 years ago. And it would have been a lot easier to do because interest rates were so low. It's going to be very hard to do that effectively now, certainly in a way that's going to challenge an economy like China. So there's that productivity question. And equally, the traditional right answer to that, which is like supply side changes, is obviously a complete dead end because most of those have been done already. Yeah. If we think of like other ways in which the age of abundance is over, there's the very obvious issue of climate breakdown, and the just like increasingly significant constraints that's going to place on our economies and on our politics as well. One of the things I think of quite a lot when it comes to the impact of climate, particularly in the US, is there is this like mounting crisis in the insurance sector. There are loads of homes and businesses in places in the US that are basically uninsurable, because they are subject to increasingly extreme weather events, because they're at risk of flooding. And the like de facto understanding amongst the insurance industry is that when this crisis properly hits, it's going to be the American state that's going to bail them out, right? Like they're not going to be able to meet all of these claims. And actually there are a lot of people now who just don't have houses that are insured, right? So the idea is that the state will pick up the tab. But investors are flooding out of US government debt right now. Like the US just got a downgrade and Trump just introduced a new round of tax cuts. That's another massive liability added to all of the liabilities that they already had, added to the liability of cleaning up after those climate disasters as well, added to the liability of the fact that these crises aren't just affecting the US, they're affecting the whole world economy. They're making it harder for us to produce food, as we've seen, recently with a bunch of the inflationary pressure that we've seen in the last few years has been because there have been crises in the production of particular food commodities. So there's the climate factor there, which again means, this age of taking for granted man's relationship with nature is over. Also, I remembered what I was going to say in response to the last question as well. Demographics, right? There is this like ticking demographic time bomb in a lot of different countries. I've just come from Korea, actually, which is like the epitome of this, right? And all of the solutions to this crisis create contradictions for the liberal worldview, and particularly the kind of more authoritarian liberal worldview. Because one solution is migration, but that's obviously off the cards if you are on the right today. The other solution is it's kind of like, the solution to productivity being that like we need to do normal social democratic politics of like state-led investment. The solution to the demographic problem in some senses is like more support for mothers and young children, and making sure childcare costs aren't too high, making sure that the labor market is constructed in such a way that you can kind of go into and leave it as you wish when you have kids. All of these things that are kind of staples of traditional social democratic politics, but are unimaginable now within the liberal worldview, basically, right?
Because so many of the things you're talking about, right, would require the reallocation of so much capital for investment. Wholesale economic redistribution of a kind that liberals are just not going to be willing to partake in.
Exactly. Like all of these things together mean anyway, you're going to be seeing lower levels of growth and potentially kind of, relatively frequent crises. And the liberal response to that is, right, okay, well, we need to marshal all our resources in promoting growth. And that means taking resources away from the kind of drains on society. We're seeing this very, very clearly in the UK, right? Which is just like desperately try and focus on some kind of abstract understanding of growth without really any understanding of the challenges that are preventing growth from emerging and how you're going to deal with those. And then actually taking investment away from the people who are the foundation of economic growth over the long run, which is like your workers who are now in the UK. We have this massive problem in the UK with people who are long-term sick, right? Why are they long-term sick? Labour says, oh, well, they're just lazy scroungers. Suddenly, over the last 10 years, it just so happens that the whole, like every, person in the UK has just become like 50% more lazy. Like what an extraordinary coincidence. No, it's because it's become harder and more stressful to live. And also, by the way, a lot of people are suffering with like long-term health issues still after the pandemic, and because of environmental factors that are making lots of people, particularly working people, less healthy. This is also something that is linked to, again, like the demographic issue, because lots of young people who are desperately struggling just to like pay their rent, get by, have a good job, have a sense of meaning and purpose in an economy that is basically geared to make them feel like little inputs to production. They're not thinking, oh yeah, I really want to sit down and have kids. They're also thinking, the world is so screwed. Like, what am I going to do next? So our elites are kind of focused on this like weird, like, fluffy goal of growth, while underneath them, all the foundations of growth, which is basically human beings, and indeed the infrastructure on which they depend, are collapsing. And they have no answer to that.
Speaking of answers, let's talk about your book. And I want to come back to a few things that we were speaking about the other night after your lecture. One of the things I really appreciated about Vulture Capitalism is how in the third section you really turn to this kind of prescriptive, series of prescriptions. You also provide a lot of quite concrete examples where people are already doing things that are very interesting. In ways, local, but also on a national and international scale as well. And I wanted to bring in here what I guess is sort of the main anchor of the last third of your book, which is, the ideas of industrial democracy, economic democracy, or some people prefer to call it workers' control, because Tony Benn, who it seems has inspired both of us quite a lot, and also Ed Broadbent, people like that in the 1970s were really engaged on this issue of industrial democracy, and it never became really central to the program of the social democratic left. But I think, as you show in the book, the ideas themselves are still. It's a really rich tradition, and it offers us a lot of answers, a lot of potential solutions in a moment like this. The other thing you're emphasizing in your book, and you spoke about this the other night as well, is one virtue of an idea like industrial democracy is that you're not, you put it this way in the book, you're not coming to people and saying, vote for me, like I'm here to save you. You're coming and you're offering them power. You're offering them, a share in the, decisions that affect their lives, their workplaces, et cetera. So I guess, first, I'm curious where you encountered the ideas of industrial democracy. Was that through Tony Benn? Is there a kind of more recent lineage of that you're tapping into? Where did that sort of come in for you in your own development?
That's a really good question. And the honest answer is, I don't think I know, because I wasn't always interested in this, right? My trajectory was like working at a left-wing think tank, becoming more engaged in Corbynism. I initially was writing mainly about like finance and financialization, and was doing policy work, thinking about how we could kind of reform the kind of grossly overweight and inefficient financial system in the UK. And I think it was like through that process that I started to think more seriously about these issues of democracy. Because the capitalist finance sector, and a lot of people have made this point, is in some senses the apogee of what I talk about in the book, of this idea of capitalist planning, right? These are like powerful institutions run by powerful individuals who basically get to decide who gets what. In some senses, you can argue that ordinary corporations are responding to market forces. They're mostly insulated from competition, but some of them are. They have less of a say over like where they invest and what they produce. Whereas for the finance sector, they are making predictions about the future to determine where they allocate investment. And those predictions are loaded, and they are influenced by, thoughts and feelings and ideas, right? So those ideas go into the kind of economy that we're trying to create. And I think when I was thinking about all these issues, it became very clear that just handing over that prerogative to allocate investment from one group of people, financial capitalists, to another, state bureaucrats, was not necessarily going to fundamentally change the power dynamics within that society. There would be shifts, definitely. You know, like the way that the Chinese financial system works, for example, which is ruthlessly controlled by central government, creates very, very different dynamics. It means, for example, that like when you have the bursting of a property bubble in China, as we did recently, that is a very carefully managed process that doesn't create a like immediate overnight crisis in the same way. So there are differences, but like it's not just handing over that role to the state doesn't create socialism, like obviously. So it was at that point that I started thinking a bit more creatively about like, okay, how can we democratize finance? And there have been some great books on this. Mike McCarthy wrote a really good book on this recently about like democratizing finance. I did a review for Jacobin. So there are all sorts of really interesting, exciting ideas in this area. And I think that was when I started to look much more about, okay, well, how could this shift look in other areas of the economy? And that was when I think I started to kind of come up with the idea as well for vulture capitalism. So like thinking about where this like idea emerged, the origin story of vulture capitalism, it was like obviously in the wake of Corbynism, realizing all these things about the difficulties of parliamentary socialism that we've already discussed, and also coming to terms with the fact that you know, there was going to be a much more active role for the state in the context of the pandemic. And, you know, that obviously was no surprise to me. I was like, okay, well, the capitalist state is always going to intervene to kind of prop up capitalists. But I realized that was not something that was widely known, because I was going on like TV shows in the UK and being asked like, okay, well, the government's now doing loads of stuff, so we have socialism now. It's like Jeremy Corbyn won the election. And so like it was those ideas about democracy. It was that sense of, okay, people don't really understand the role of the capitalist state. And then again, to bring, you know, we're in Toronto, so I'm going to bring up Leo again. Conversations I had with Leo, and he got me actually to write a piece for Socialist Register like during this time, which was about the tech monopolies in the state. So the way in which those tech companies have been really dependent on and linked with particularly the American state, but also other powerful capitalist states. And all of these things together kind of were this very like clear critique of this new, very kind of self-confident form of kind of authoritarian state capitalism. And relatedly, it's opposite, because as soon as you take on that critique of like, okay, you know, this state is just as much a part of this system as capital itself, then you start having to grapple with the question, okay, what's the opposite of that? Because so much of what I'd been doing before was like, we need a Green New Deal, we need the government to invest things to stop austerity, we need, you know, more intervention and more spending on welfare, etc. But when you accept this critique, you realize that those things can and do exist within a system that doesn't fundamentally challenge the power of capital. And that if, you know, the free market is not the opposite of state planning, then like what is socialism, right? And that was when I really started to take seriously some of these ideas about like, okay, what does democracy look like? I had been familiar already with the work of Ellen Meiksins, which is why I'm here right now to deliver that lecture. And it was her book, Democracy Against Capitalism, as well, that helped me to consolidate a lot of those ideas. And she has a line, I think, that I quote at the start of the book, which is that at this stage in history, democracy is synonymous with socialism. So yeah, like Ellen's work, Tony Benn's life and work, with which I was already very familiar, and that tradition of industrial democracy, particularly via the Lucas Plan, which was something that like a bunch of people that I knew on the British left had been to a greater or lesser extent involved in. It all like drew me down this path, and I'm really glad it did, because like focusing on those real world examples of people coming together to change their worlds, whether that's workers taking over a factory or, you know, community organizers like pushing for participatory budgeting, or like, you know, workers co-op movements, or tenants unions, or whatever stuff that may, maybe at the start of my political career, I admit I might have dismissed as like folk politics. All of that stuff now I not only see as like really integral in shifting the balance of power to such an extent that an institutional left project becomes possible, but it's also the stuff that gives you hope. like, you know, it's very easy to look at the world around us right now and, as you say, like be super pessimistic and terrified and see chaos everywhere. But as soon as you like get off the internet and speak to people who are responding to the problems that they see in collective ways, you realize that we are not as cooked as everyone thinks. You know, maybe we are at a macro level cooked, right? In which case we need to start thinking seriously about how do we work together to survive and protect each other. I'm not that pessimistic. I don't think we are cooked at like a macro level either. But if we're not, then like the roots of this new model are already visible in all these different places. And that is, again, not to say that these things are inherently revolutionary in themselves. I'm not like we're going to take down capitalism by like, you know, having a bunch of community meetings to protect our local libraries. Like, of course not. But the foundations of a new system, one that is based on cooperation, on democracy, on basically respecting the rights of people to run their own lives, that is already emerging in a bunch of different places. So that's why I think like, and it's been this really roundabout route for me from like, you know, this very like top down, think tanky policy prescription role for me where I was like, no, we're just going to take over the state, do these clever things that I've invented, and then everything will be fine, through to like, oh wait, actually no, like the ideas that are going to be the foundation of social transformation will not come from clever people sitting in think tanks. Like they're already happening in lots of different places, and it's our role to kind of highlight them, bring them together, and then try to translate that into a much broader social strategy.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we talked about this the other night as well, but I want to bring in this other thread from your book, which is, I mean, there are so many other approaches to political economy that are not captured in that debate. It's kind of a parochial one. But now especially, it's so unhelpful to think of things as, well, you can either have planning or you can either have markets. You know, you write in the book, we don't live in free market democratic societies. We live in systems of centralized capitalist planning. And I don't know, I think this is such a worthwhile point. It's worth underscoring again. I mean, break that down a little bit for us some more. I mean, what exactly do you mean by that when you talk about capitalist central planning, and why is that distinction that's been handed down from the Cold War, basically? Why is that so unhelpful?
So the reason I think it's unhelpful is actually one that was highlighted by Hayek himself. I'm really interested reading Hayek in his like proximity to debates that were taking place at the time around like systems theory and cybernetics and complexity. Like Hayek takes these ideas and basically says, look, the market economy is a complex system. It cannot be centrally planned. It is this like self-organizing system that if you try to exert too much top-down control, it will basically collapse. And I thought this was a really interesting idea, and I agree with it. And I actually think that that's a big part of what's wrong with capitalism. Because if you look at the exercise, the kind of rigid and rigorous exercise of top-down authority within capitalist economies by a small number of very powerful people, it's extraordinary. And I'm not just talking about states here. The original idea for this actually came through thinking about how firms, how corporations within capitalism are organized. Now, some of you may know, I actually had a stint at the very start of my career working in a management consulting firm, working at KPMG, and spending like a few months really just working there. I was so astonished at the kind of inefficiencies and politics and authoritarianism and all of the things that so obviously characterize the way that capitalist enterprises work. And you see it all the time, you know, just reading like the pages of the Financial Times, the companies section, reading about the mistakes and the kind of turf wars, the really like silly and inefficient decisions that have been made by corporate executives.
All of this stuff, by the way, that the neoliberal revolution was supposed to abolish, right?
Yeah.
Because all of those things, everything you just described, that was supposed to be embodied by, you know, the bureaucratized post-war state.
Exactly.
And we didn't get rid of it. We just outsourced it to the private sector.
Yeah, exactly. And now you have these companies that have become these huge fiefdoms because a company like Amazon didn't obey the pressures of the market when it wasn't profitable for 14 years. It didn't think, okay, well, we need to reallocate capital in this firm because we're not making any money. No, they thought, okay, we need to expand and grow and grow and grow and grow and grow until we become basically this powerful political institution that can protect our, the foundations of our wealth through like basically, like not force overtly, but through like political control. Because that's really what a monopoly is. It's like not just an economic institution, it's also an institution that has political power, corporate sovereignty, as some people call it in the literature. And that corporate sovereignty comes from, yes, the control over resources, control over markets, also links with the state, right, as well. And when you have that kind of political power, it means you're insulated from market pressure. It means you can make decisions about who gets what. It means you can plan. And so you see this very clearly within monopolistic corporations, within capitalism. I used a bunch of examples in there. The one I always come back to is Boeing, because it just perfectly epitomizes all of these relationships between like monopolistic corporations, capitalist states and empires. But I also look at how this plays out within financial institutions, as we've just been talking about, kind of arch planners in some ways of capitalism. I look at how it plays out within the capitalist state. So not just taking this idea of the state as like a tool or an instrument or something that's neutral, but seeing it as a social relation. So how capitalist planning is shaped by the balance of power, the balance of forces within society. And then I project that out to how it looks at the kind of level of empire. Going all the way back to like, what I think is a really great example of how this has existed from the very origins of capitalism, which is the East India Company. So Adam Smith writes years ago when he was around, the East India Company is a strange absurdity because it is a market in the disguise of a state. So this is obviously like a direct contradiction of what Adam Smith believes about how capitalism works, but it is one of the most powerful institutions within this emerging capitalist social system, and it is a joint venture between a bunch of merchants and the British state in pursuit of imperial power. So yeah, this type of planning has existed for a very long time. And in many ways, it's a kind of simple extension of the idea that a lot of Marxist theorists, particularly in the kind of political Marxist tradition, would have, which is that capitalism tries to enforce a separation between the political and the economic, but it never does so successfully. That there are always these overlaps and these really kind of deep links between political and economic power. And you see that in the corporation, you see that with states. It's really important to expose those, to repoliticize the economic, and to say, right, well, if political power can be used to bail out banks, then why can't it be used to support working people?
Grace, your next project sounds quite an optimistic one. Might be nice to end the conversation on a more optimistic note, given everything we've covered. So what can you tell us about your next book?
Yeah, so my next book is about individualism and collective organizing. As I've been looking into all these ideas about like democracy and democratizing the economy, I kind of came to the realization that the biggest thing standing in the way of this stuff was not that people didn't think it was a good idea, not that people didn't think it was necessary. It was just literally this like astonishingly deeply rooted belief that we all seem to have that it's impossible to cooperate in the societies that we live in. And this is hardly surprising. It was a central pillar of neoliberalism to convince us of that. And so many of the institutions within which we would have been cooperating in the past have disappeared. So I really wanted to like understand this trend of individualism. And as you go into it, you realize how much of our lives, how many of the problems that like particularly young people are experiencing today come down to this individualistic mentality, and how many of the issues within our own political project come down to this individualistic mentality, particularly this whole like heroes, victims narrative and way of doing politics that I think characterizes a lot of the left today. So like looking at that issue, how individualism is affecting us across a bunch of different areas, and then saying, okay, well, how are people actually working together in ways that disprove this way of looking at social relationships and in ways that kind of chart a path out. And I'm really glad that I'm able to do this because it just involves having loads of really interesting and inspiring conversations with activists and organizers all over the world who are just like, well, the world is burning, so what are we going to do about it? And I kind of think this form of politics overcomes the the kind of like culture versus economy dichotomy that we've seen on the left, which is rooted in this idea that, either we can focus on identity or we can focus on economics. And, this critique now that we're all familiar with, that we went way too far down the kind of identitarian victimhood line, which I have some sympathy with because it does rest on this kind of individualistic idea of like heroes and victims. But when you actually stop having debates with people online and you root your politics in stuff that's going on in the real world, you realize that like economics and identity are not separate in any way. Like so much of what the backlash that we're seeing today on the far right is rooted in is a loss of identity that is linked to a sense of economic disempowerment, and the different ways of responding to that. And like, obviously, the way that young men are responding to that sense of economic dislocation by like reasserting aggressively masculine like identity. Those two things are very closely interlinked. And equally, when you go and you speak to people about, okay, well, how are you responding to this crisis of capitalism that is affecting you economically because you can't afford to pay your rent and your wages are low and we have a cost of living crisis, which is also affecting your sense of hope, your sense of community, your ideas about the future. And the people who are responding to that in like hopeful and optimistic ways are being like, well, we're just working together to build something new and to create community that can give us a sense of belonging and solidarity, but which also supports us to kind of create a different economic model as well. So yeah, I kind of think this is the future for the left. Not because I think that all we need to do is like build co-ops and then capitalism will fall apart, but because I think that this is the way of challenging neoliberal subjectivity. And unless we challenge neoliberal subjectivity, we're not going to be able to build powerful political movements.
I think that's a good note to end on. Grace, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Luke.
That was Grace Blakeley, UK-based economist and writer, and the recipient of the 2025 Ellen Meiksins Wood Prize, in conversation with Luke Savage, co-author of Seeking Social Democracy with Ed Broadbent, Jacobin columnist, and friend of the Broadbent Institute. You can share and listen to the full Ellen Meiksins Wood lecture at perspectivesjournal.ca. And if you like this conversation, share and subscribe to Perspectives, a Canadian journal of political economy and social democracy on all major podcast platforms, as well as Press Progress's award-winning Sources podcast that digs deeper into the news stories you won't find in the major papers. The Perspectives Journal podcast and Sources are proud members of the Harbinger Media Network, Canada's progressive podcast community. You can read more in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca.